Welcome to Culture Radar, Australia's leading smart safety culture platform. Do you want to transform your safety culture from your Achilles heel into your competitive edge? Stay tuned to find out how, as Dr. Garry Marling shines a light on important safety issues as he interviews globally recognised safety experts and talks about why an appropriate safety culture is vital to you and your organisation. Are you putting your people at the centre of safety? Find out now.
Dave, look, thanks very much for coming in for our inaugural Culture and Coffee session. And you're from People and Risk, and I love the name of your company, putting those two words together, and especially the emphasis on people first. So tell us a little bit about People and Risk and what you do.
Thanks, Gary. So, it's nothing special. It's just me, really. I mean, I wanted to obviously have a brand that represented what I did. And to be really honest, I'm still kind of struggling with if that's what it is. But it is in the end about how people deal with uncertainty. I suppose that's what's always appealed to me. And in the most recent study, that's what I was kind of focusing on. I've now probably drifted more into the broad area of culture and engagement, which is probably part of the reason we're here. But essentially, I've been in safety a long time and had a variety of roles and done a lot of training stuff and different pieces. And I've felt myself drifting into this area of, why people do what they do. And now more broadly in terms of how that's influenced by the social context around them. So it's a good question, and I'm not sure I'm answering it well, but People and Risk is still just me working with companies on how they deal with people. I suppose that's if I can summarise it that way.
So Dave, I've had a look at your website, and I've known you a while, and I've heard you talk, and you're heavily influenced by possibly a new theme coming through in the safety world, the social psychology of risk. So how does that impact on people in terms of managing their risks?
Yeah, cool. So I guess obviously that's that idea of, framed up as the idea of sort of worldviews in safety, which in itself is still an emerging issue, but it's one of the ways that I frame the work that I do to try and give it some context. So I would summarise it down and say social psychology within a safety context is looking at how people's safety decisions and behaviour is influenced by the world and people around them. That's, I guess, fundamentally what social psych is about, is how people are influenced by the world around them. And I think that's got some relevance in safety when you're tackling issues like behaviour and why groups of people do different things. I really try to be clear to separate myself out then from other areas of safety. I would not be very good at trying to brief a board on legal issues because I'll want to keep talking about cultural stuff. I shouldn't be doing slip testing. I shouldn't be doing hygiene monitoring. I shouldn't be necessarily writing procedures unless I'm giving advice about language. And I shouldn't be designing guards. So there's a whole bunch of stuff that I don't think social psych is suited to, but I think it's well suited to tackling culture, because in the end, for me, culture is about the group sort of beliefs and assumptions.
Great. So you've used the term culture a few times. So how do you see culture, and how do you think it can be tackled?
Yeah, cool. So that in itself is a really cool conversation that I like having with companies, is just to ask that and say, well, what does culture mean? Because the answers to that reflect the existing set of beliefs. So broadly, I would tend to go towards Edgar Schein's concept of culture. That's the most common definition that I would use, which shortened down is shared assumptions and beliefs. Lengthened out, and I often don't always get the wording right, but is sort of shared assumptions and beliefs that have been developed as groups of people solve problems, internal and external problems in the organisation that are considered valid enough to be taught to others. So it's and to contrast that, it's shared beliefs and assumptions, and I'll directly contrast against that, against maybe a more orthodox view where you might hear culture is the way we do things around here. That tends to align culture with behaviour, and so it tends to then mean organisations, when they're trying to look at culture, they look at behaviour, whereas my context would be culture drives behaviour. And that's sort of where I come to. Now, in saying that, to complicate it even further, I still like using other models to help organisations imagine culture. So Dr. Rob Long talks about culture as a cloud, and that's a really interesting metaphor or allegory for it, because it's this thing that you can't touch, but you can feel it and see it. And again, that's the paradox. Most people in an organisation can easily talk about culture. It's good, bad, toxic, healthy, but can't always define it easily. I use Cameron and Quinn's model of the competing values framework. It doesn't necessarily define culture again, but what it does is give us a great model for organisations to be able to understand what's going on and what are the competing forces at play. I use Hudson's culture maturity model. Again, in my opinion, it doesn't help you move. Like, I don't think Hudson's work is particularly useful for how to change, but it's really useful to give context. And it helps predict where you are and what's going on. So that's that would be my most common sort of models that I use. The other thing that Shine talks about is culture existing at three levels. So artifacts, things we see, hear, feel and touch, espoused beliefs, and then underlying assumptions. So Shine's two concepts of shared assumptions and beliefs, and the sort of model helps say, this is what we're talking about, but also it can be out of alignment, and it's different from sort of good or bad in there. So they're the sort of models I use. The other part in how to tackle it, that's a tricky one. At its simplest, and I'm wary that it sounds too simple, that I think the primary tool that we can bring to bear is language. So I sometimes talk about language as being the currency of culture. And by language, that could be written language as well. That's signs, symbols, spoken, even
the whole semiotics.
The semiotics of it, yes, that's right, yeah. So where semiotics is about the sort of meaning of signs, symbols and language. So when I'm talking to companies about what is culture and how to influence it, I consistently come back to language. When I'm listening to organisations talk, I'm always listening to the language, because that's a sign that, it's an indicator of what's going on, of what the shared beliefs are underneath it. So when you hear somebody say, don't bother reporting anything around here, nobody does anything. So that language is an indicator of some underlying belief. And if it's a shared belief, then that's a cultural element, and that's something that an organisation might want to tackle. How do they tackle it? They could tell everybody to report stuff, or I would say they could tell stories about the value of reporting. And stories are a really cool way of influencing meaning and beliefs. The challenge I'm aware of in all this is it's really warm and fuzzy. You can't proceduralise it. You can't measure it. That's you can't measure stories and things like that is what I mean. So I don't know if that made sense.
Oh, that's very good. One of the terms that's coming through strongly from a lot of practitioners like ourselves, and I know you talk about this, is high reliability organisations. So from a social psychology point of view, what does that mean?
Yeah, cool. So the first exposure I had to reliability or high reliability organisations for me comes out of the work of Carl Wieck. Carl Wieck was a social psychologist, so it's obviously close to my heart, because it came out for me coherently the first time in a book called The Social Psychology of Organising, so published in 1979. It's interesting to think how long the concept's been around for. What I will say is I'm a little concerned that what is happening is we're taking concepts, which just happens in safety all the time, taking concepts that are around, like the 5 elements of reliability that Wieck first talked about, and we take them and apply them in other settings. So we're seeing them being applied now, I think, from a systems thinking point of view, and maybe in other areas or worldviews of safety. And as a sideline, I'm a little worried that might not go well. So the social psych part of it, the real framing that Wieck gives it is high reliability organisations, or being reliable, he actually talks about as mindfulness, organisations being mindful. And to take that one level further, he actually doesn't talk about organisations, he talks about people organising. So he would say that HRO is something that you do, not something you are. So organisations are HROing, not HROs. And the reason for that, in my view, and looking at his work, is because it's about a set of beliefs and assumptions that exist in an organisation that influence how the organisation and the people respond when something's not right. So HROs look like normal organisations nearly all the time, under business as usual. It's only when something unexpected happens or there's high uncertainty or an incident occurs that they respond differently. And so when you then apply the 5 elements of reliability or mindfulness that Vic talked about as a set of beliefs, you say, so reliable organisations have a preoccupation with failure. So it's not about trying to say you've got to be pessimistic all the time, but they maintain a belief that despite all of our planning, you never know what could surprise us. They resist overconfidence and they resist hubris. That is an interesting area in orthodox safety where if you've gone 1 million hours lost time injury free, you tend to think you're safer. And so it's so attractive to go, we're a really safe organisation, a reliable organisation. And I actually think this aligns well with generative and some other concepts as well, would be saying we get more concerned with the length of time we go without an incident because because they know uncertainty is a fact. And so they get more worried that we're missing things. So it's not they're pessimistic or paranoid, but they're like, they've got this chronic unease, or as Dr. Long would say, they entertain doubt all the time. So they've got this preoccupation with failure. They've got good sensitivity to operations, which really just means they're connected to their front line. So one of the ways that you hear about impending signs of disaster early is people tell you, it doesn't come up in data, but to hear that, you've got to be connected with your front line. It's one of the reasons why large organisations have a natural problem with it, because the leaders are naturally disconnected. But it's about a belief that when things are uncertain, the people who are best placed to inform me, if I'm a leader, are my frontline staff. That's a belief I've got to have. I think it's really hard to systemise that.
So it's like a flattening out of the organisational structure to get that information up quicker and to those who can make decisions.
Absolutely, yeah. But you've got to believe. So again, an example I might give here is there's conflicting information. Our data says we're running well, but we're getting all this discontent from the front line, and there's people saying things like something's about to go wrong. We're just being lucky, and there's high turnover or something like that. So the data looks fine safety-wise, but the feeling is something's not right. So how do I satisfy that? So first of all, I've got to be okay with, is this an impending warning sign? So I've got this preoccupation with failure, or this is something. I then have to have a sensitivity to it to hear it and be willing to investigate. Now, the third element, which is a reluctance to simplify, if I turn that around, is a willingness to complicate. So it's really much more attractive to go, well, the data still says we're fine, we're okay, or to go and get an audit done, or to talk to my Lex line manager down or line manager up and go, what do you think? And the problem is they'll go, yeah, it's fine. In that situation, though, as a leader, I might be willing to go, no, something doesn't feel right, and I'm going to investigate. And that is difficult because it's time and effort and money, and it might make things worse because when you scratch the surface on some of these things, turns out, it could be a maintenance thing. It could be that you've got this, you keep getting your maintenance program audited and everything looks fine, but the feedback from staff is that things are breaking down a bit more often than we might expect. So that's weird information. Do I scratch the surface on my maintenance program and actually find out that it's completely a facade? Do I really want to know that? That's tough for organisations to do, and that's what I think that a reluctance to simplify is about. So those first 3 things are beliefs that organisations have. The second 2 are about, the first 3 are, you see weak danger signals earlier, that's the language of high reliability, and the last two are deference to expertise and a commitment to resilience. So when things go wrong and are uncertain and fudgy, you need people who have the most expertise to be able to make decisions, not necessarily the most authority. If you need a maintenance person to be able to shut something down, or you need a person on site to call in some extra staff or whatever it is, and the classic would be cost of that. If it's going to cost $10,000, but normally to get a $10,000 spend, you've got to talk to 2 managers up. That's an authority versus expertise issue. Now, normally business as usual, that's how it should work. That's why you have authority levels. But at critical times, you need to move away from that. A system won't work if I've got to wait for my manager to turn up the next day. Again, it's very difficult to systemise that, but that's what that deference to expertise is. Somebody on the front line makes a call and everyone in the organisation says, we'll back you. Sometimes they're going to make the call and it was wrong. And that's the tricky time when they've got to say, we still back you because we get it. And the commitment to resilience, is just a thing of saying we know things are uncertain, we know things will go wrong, but we've got a commitment to stay on track rather than being derailed. It's a touchy issue here, but I've spoken to some people where you see organisations overreact to incidents. You see whole industries have a 2-day stand down for safety.
We've seen it recently in the mining industry, haven't we?
Absolutely, yeah. And if you talk to somebody on site who's at a different site and say, why you stood down, they don't know. And they say, I don't know what I'm meant to do. I don't understand what we're meant to do with this. And so it actually, I think, makes things a bit worse. So that's a broad level of, we know things will happen and we don't like them, but it doesn't derail us. And even things like resources it's okay. Why do we have extra staff, or why do we have extra resources, or why have we built contingency in our maintenance plan? So because we know things go wrong and we don't want it to derail us. I did work with a council, and I asked them, typically how many weeks a year do they have unplanned maintenance stuck in their maintenance schedule? And they said it's like usually 2 to 4 weeks. And this might be because of weather, but it also is because councillors get involved and, people, things happen. So every year, 2 to 4 weeks of unplanned maintenance work gets stuck in their planned maintenance program. I said, so do you plan with only 11 months or 11 and a half months of maintenance? And they're like, no. Because at the beginning of the year when they do their maintenance plan, if they left a 1 month gap, they'd get ridiculed for it. So they have to plan it out 12 months, even though they know they'll never hit it. So it's a paradox for them, but a commitment to resilience is about going, we think resilience is more important than looking right. So again, long explanation, but it's why I come back to reliability or organisation being mindful is about this set of beliefs that are maintained, not so much a set of processes. And it's why they look normal nearly all the time, but it's when things go wrong, they respond differently. They see weak danger signals and they respond better.
Great. I love the concept of being an HRO versus HROing.
Yeah,
that's a great explanation. Dave, that was a great description of HRO. In fact, the part that I loved was how you described HROing as compared to being a high reliability organisation, and the number of elements that went into that. Now, besides HROs, there are a number of what we could describe as possibly just good practice things that people should be doing as part of their culture as well. So considering that sort of bag of issues or elements we need to think about in terms of culture, can you give us your opinion in terms of measuring culture, how you make people understand their culture, how people can shape their culture for where they want it to be, because we live in a dynamic world, things are always changing, and you need to meet not only your safety objectives, but also your business objectives, and they might be competing as well. So if you can just give us your opinion on that.
Yep, cool. So I think you can measure elements of culture. I'd come back to, for me, if it's about underlying beliefs and assumptions, we can clearly expose them and uncover them, and we can measure them. So, and using probably the other element of alignment. The tricky part, I think, with measurement can be benchmarking, and it's an uncertain area for me. The risk that an organisation's, because it's so desirable in orthodox safety, right, to want to measure ourselves compared with others. So we can analyse and measure, I think, elements of culture. The tricky part is then to say, how does that compare to someone else? Because that might be a tricky thing to reliably say. But if I come back to that broader question, part of the work that I think organisations need to go through and they need to tackle is, well, if we want to work on culture meaningfully, then you need to have an aligned concept of, first of all, what culture means. So that's something in itself. Otherwise, you've got all the leaders talking about culture, but are they talking about behaviour? Are they talking about beliefs? Are they talking about consequences? What are they talking about? So if we talk about safety then, once I would say, if you pick a belief like it's about shared beliefs, shared assumptions, then within safety, it's like, well, what beliefs do we want to have in this organisation? So an example might be, we think it's really important that people feel like they can stop unsafe tasks. So that's a classic one, right? And the reason I say that is because it's one of these ones where organisations tell everybody. So this isn't a knowledge thing. Like, this is why beliefs are different from knowledge, and why Shine's concept of artefacts espouse beliefs and underlying assumptions works. If I ask anybody in an organisation, do you have the right to stop an unsafe task? They will all say yes. If they trust me and I say to them, can you? Probably what they'll say is it depends. And again, this highlights the complex nature of it. If somebody's got a broken chair, they're probably okay going, my chair's broken. You know, I'm not going to sit on that chair unless it's safe. So that's a form of stopping unsafe task, right? But if somebody's been up all night because their kids have kept them awake and they didn't sleep a wink, and they've got a deadline at 10 a.m. that morning, and they're thinking, I shouldn't come to work this morning. The right thing to do here is really to ring and go, I shouldn't come to work. Can they? And that's a different thing, right? So what's influencing that is their belief of what will happen. What's the right thing to do now? And that's been influenced by it. Now, can I measure that? I think you can. I think you can ask questions around, that they need to be tricky questions, because if you just say, can you refuse to do an unsafe task? People will go yes or no. But if you were running a focus group, for example, you might get a different response there, but that's harder to quantify. But you could get that information out. You could ask some questions in the right way, like you could ask an absolute question around there's no reason to do any unsafe task or something like that, and you'd get an interesting response there because of the absoluteness of it. You're forcing people to say every task you could stop, and they might not agree with that, and you get some data. Some examples of stuff I've seen too is where you ask questions exposing these different beliefs in different ways. So you might ask a group of people, do mistakes improve our systems? And most people will be like, yeah, absolutely. So you could get some data on that about generally, 85% of people in the organisation agree that mistakes and errors improve systems. But then you might ask a question that's quite emotive around something like, errors are tolerated around here, which is quite an emotive question because using tolerate, not accepted.
Back to language again.
Again, it's all about language, and it's all about what you're trying to push people in there. And even, by the way, how you say, we can report something around here versus I can report something. I and we will get you a difference between I believe safety is important, we believe safety is important, and you'll get a different response. The tricky part is you've got to interpret that.
Even the word we, the interpretation of that, is it my team or is it the organisation?
Absolutely, yeah. And you might sometimes want to choose to change that. Our organisation manages incidents well, or one I use. So I know I haven't quite answered that last question, and I'm going to come back to my comment around benchmarking. The tricky part is you might sometimes customise questions for an organisation. So I did some work in an organisation that specifically wanted to address bullying. So we put in a question in a survey we did, basically saying our organisation manages bullying well. It was just an outright question, but well is subjective. So, we were after that subjective response. And what we got was an overwhelming no, like a disagreement with that statement. And because we also had some stacking in there between leaders and workers, we could see a variation of how that was answered. So leaders thought they managed it better than frontline workers did, which isn't a surprise. We see things like that in that. Mistakes improve our systems. Yeah. Errors are tolerated around here. No. But interesting, what we got was leaders in the organisation were much more positive. So errors are tolerated around here. Absolutely. Frontline workers, errors are tolerated. No. So that's an alignment issue, which is still separate to, do we want to tolerate errors? And you've got to tackle both, right? You've got to tackle, why is it that our leaders think we're more tolerant of errors than our workers? What's going on? Now, there's an element of probably optimism bias. There's also an element of people are more forgiving of their own errors. So leaders are more forgiving of their own stuff-ups, and therefore they think the organisation is, because they're the organisation. Frontline workers just get hammered when they stuff up. So that's what they see. Anyway, it's more likely, for example, that a frontline worker error leads to a safety incident than a leader error as well. So psychologically, they'll probably see those areas as more critical. There's a whole lot of dynamics going on. That's tricky to measure, but I think what you can do is measure elements of how people answer and then do probably focus group and then try and pluck away at it, which is again where I'd say you can get some really good data and you could benchmark yourself over time. But I'm unsure about the benchmarking against another organisation only because they might have a different set of drivers. Even if you've had an incident, the recency of that incident will influence how groups respond, which is sort of a climate response as well, which is why I think context is everything too. Like if you're in the mining industry at the moment, you'll have a different vibe than in the hotel industry. But 5 years ago, the regulator did a massive push on hotel industry, and so that they were getting regulated and they were getting visited a lot more, and they would have a different response to questions around it. So, yeah, it's tricky and it's variable, and it's one of the reasons why I both empathise with organisations, but also say you've got to tackle this. It is hard to quantify. So even in the safety world, I say you need a coherent way of describing what safety means. So this would be an example culturally where I'd come back to. Most often organisations at the simplest level will anchor safety to harm. So they'll come back and say, were we safe? And the answer is embedded in, did we harm anybody? What's our data? That sort of stuff. Even though they talk about other things, it's still, even if it's, did you go home at the end of the day? It's still a harm-based response. So the problem with that is if we didn't harm anybody, then we were safe. But when you're having your barbecue for 1 million lost time injury hours free or whatever, and you're saying you're safe, the workers may well have a different opinion. So culturally, you've got this problem there. So I say you need a different way or a more complex way of describing safety. I think safety should be linked to risk, which is about uncertainty. So we come back to this idea of, you have to embrace uncertainty, which means you have to have entertained doubt. You can't be overconfident. The problem is you can't measure risk as easily. So we didn't hurt anybody this week, but we, even from a structured point of view, you might have been outside your acceptable risk levels. But how many times, the desire to measure it's there, but you can't measure it. But if you said, okay, our safety to us means nobody gets hurt, but to do that, and you frame off the outcome to the process, to do that we need to make sure we're managing our risks, that our workers are supported. You might also include, we need to make sure we look after the well-being of our people, which is again a very tricky area. But you might have 4 or 5 aspects of what being safe looks like. Some might be behavioural, some risk, some outcome like harm, but you anchor it to it. And it would mean then that at the end of the week or 6 months, you could say, were we safe? You go, well, we didn't hurt anybody, but we think that a number of times we were outside of our risk tolerance, or we haven't looked after people's well-being. And what that means then is you've got a different context to say we're not safe. Culturally, so I come back to the culture, then you're changing the beliefs of the organisation because you're changing the language. We didn't hurt anybody, but we weren't safe. Suddenly now the focus becomes, well, what do you mean we weren't safe? Well, we burnt out 3 people, or we've got 2 off on stress leave, or we, had 3 events where we were outside our risk acceptance. And you've got, because the language has changed, people will now change their focus about what they pay attention to. Leaders will, I guarantee, if you said to the board, nobody got hurt over the last 6 months, but we're really confident we weren't safe at least 5 times, they're going to get really fixated on that 5 times. The issue is you still can't measure it, and I accept the paradox that comes with that, but I think that's what being a more mature organisation starts looking like over time. And it's I haven't, in no way am I putting up my hand saying I've found a solution to that, but I think it's a path forward. A client, I worked with their senior leaders, and they specifically raised the issue of fatigue and burnout. So they know they're burning out their staff. It's an engineering services business. But they're just not sure. They're stuck in this bind of, we work to deadlines, we make people do long hours, but we're not sure how to fix it. And so I've started saying, well, let's include the idea of wellbeing in the idea of safety. Let's link that language. And I think what will happen then is in 12 to 24 months' time, there'll be dissonance created. So it's a form of cognitive dissonance, but it's happening organisationally within the people. Is they're going to have to look at each other and say, we keep saying that safety is about wellbeing, but we keep treating our people like dirt. And so what should happen is that dissonance should build up over time. And then I would be being smart. I'd say, well, stop talking about wellness then, because at least that way you'll feel better. And hopefully they'll say, no, but we want it to be about wellness. And I'll say, okay, we'll stop treating your people like dirt. And it's a way of using language to manipulate power and ethics and meaning in the organisation. Can you measure that? Probably you can measure elements of it, and I think you can benchmark that over time.
I like the fact that you've brought up that benchmarking with other people or other organisations is something that needs to be carefully thought through, because the dynamics or the nature and scope of a particular business within an industry might be different to another business in the same industry. So benchmarking against yourself is probably the better way to go.
I think it's more meaningful, and because everyone loves meaning, that's what humans do, add meaning to things, and we love data. And I personally go, there's nothing wrong with data, it's only ever what we make it mean. So same thing, a lower injury rate, we tend to make it mean we're safer, even though it might not. So there's a constant tension as soon as you go down a path of measuring anything, of managing what people are going to make it mean. So I like the idea of having some data on cultural elements, because I think it gives you something to talk about. It's a context. The risk to manage at the same time is managing what it means. There's a natural will, I'm assuming, in every organisation that there'll be a percentage or a number, and that'll be used as to say what our culture's like, and that then it gets reported up. And as soon as it gets reported up, the meaning around it gets lost, and it becomes a number and a score. And that could, because suddenly now you've got, well, we want to be 95 without knowing what does that really mean. And so I heard an example yesterday, which was just one of these funny ones. A company had an incident where somebody was dehydrated. And so they sent out a flash alert and they told everybody it's important you're hydrated. 2 weeks later, they had an issue where somebody was overhydrated. And it, there's a bit more to it, but trade-offs, power, ethics, trajectory, this is all the language that needs to come along with it. And having conversations like, if we're going to start measuring culture, that's okay, but what are we going to do with the data and what do we make it mean? And I would advise organisations to try and have those conversations as early as possible.
You can't understand it unless you go through that.
That's right, process. Yeah. You just want to be on top of it all the time. What's this going to mean and where are we going with it? So,
excellent. Dave, thanks very much for having coffee as we discuss culture. It's been a really good insight into how your take on culture and the other aspects of your business too. Again, thank you. You're the inaugural one, and we hope that the others can measure up to this one.
Well,
We've been talking about benchmarks. I think you've set a high benchmark.
Well, thank you. I just really appreciate the opportunity to share kind of some of my beliefs and thoughts on it and get it out there. And I think I know a little bit about some things, but I'm really happy to say I don't know a lot about a lot of other stuff. So I appreciate the opportunity. Thanks.
Terrific.